Right then, I think we'll be able to get this done in 2 parts. Let's read on. Back on the quad, Alex raced across the cliff tops, with the sun already sinking in the west. Ahead of him, he could see the single chimney and crumbling tower that he hoped would mark the entrance to the Cunnerwick Shaft, which took its name from the ancient language of Cornwall, because Cornwall in Cornish language is called Kernow. So, interesting. According to the map, this was where he should begin. At least the quad had made his life easier. It would have taken him an hour to reach it on foot. He was running out of time and he knew it. Already the Stormbreakers would have begun leaving the plant. In less than 24 hours, the Prime Minister would be activating them. If the software really had been infected with some sort of virus, what would happen? Some sort of humiliation for both Sale and the British government? Or worse? How did a computer bug tie in with what he had seen that night before? Whatever the submarine had been delivering at the jetty, it couldn't be anything to do with computers. The silver boxes with their vacuum seals looked like something out of Star Wars, and you don't shoot a man for dropping a hard drive. He's assuming it's a computer virus. That's all I'm saying. Alex parked the quad next to the tower and went in through an arched doorway. At first he thought he must have made some sort of mistake. The building looked more like a ruined church than the entrance to a mine. Other people had been here before him. There were a few crumpled beer cans and old crisp packets on the floor and the usual graffiti on the walls. JRH was here. Nick loves Cass. Visitors leaving the worst parts of themselves behind in fluorescent paint. His foot came down on something that clanged, and he saw that he was standing on a metal trapdoor set into the concrete floor. Grass and weeds were sprouting round the edges, but putting his hand against the crack, he could feel a draught of air rising from below. This must be the entrance to the shaft. The trapdoor was bolted down with a heavy padlock, several centimetres thick. Alex swore under his breath. He had left the zit cream back in his room. The cream would have eaten through the bolt in seconds. But he didn't have the time to go all the way back to Sale Enterprises to get it. He knelt down and shook the padlock in frustration. To his surprise, it swung open in his hand. Somebody had been here before him. Ian Ryder. It had to be. He must have managed to unlock it and hadn't fully closed it again, so that it would be ready when he came back. Alex pulled the padlock out and grabbed hold of the trapdoor. It took all his strength to pull it up, and as he did so, a blast of cold air hit him in the face. The trapdoor clanged back, and he found himself looking into a black hole that stretched further than daylight could reach. Alex shone his torch into the hole. The beam went about 50 metres, but the shaft went further. He found a pebble and dropped it in. At least 10 seconds passed before the pebble rattled against something far below. A rusty ladder ran down the side of the shaft. Alex checked that the quad was out of sight, then looped the rope over his shoulder and shoved the torch into his belt. He didn't enjoy climbing into the hole. The metal rungs were ice cold against his hands, and his shoulders had barely sunk beneath the level of the ground before the light was blotted out, and he felt himself being sucked into a darkness so total that he couldn't climb and hold on to the torch. He just had to feel his way. A hand, then a foot, descending further and ever further until at last his heels struck the bottom and he knew he had reached the bottom of the Cunnerwick shaft. He looked up. He could just make out the entrance he had climbed through, small, round, as distant as the moon, breathing heavily, trying to fight off the sense of claustrophobia. He pulled out the torch and flicked it on. The beam leapt out of his hand, pointing the way ahead and throwing pure white light onto his immediate surroundings. Alex was at the start of a long tunnel, the uneven walls and ceilings held back by wooden beams. The floor was already damp, and a sheen of salt water hung in the air. It was cold in the mine. He had known it would be, and before he moved, he pulled on the jersey he had bought, then chalked a large X on the wall. That had been a good idea. Whatever happened down here, he wanted to be sure he could find the way back. Good thinking. At last he was ready. He took 2 steps forward, away from the vertical shaft, and into the start of the tunnel, and immediately felt the weight of the solid rock, soil, and remaining streaks of tin bearing down on him. It was horrible here. It really was like being buried alive, and it took all his strength to force himself on. After about 50 paces, he came to a second tunnel, branching off to the left. He took out the photocopied map and examined it in his torchlight. According to Ian Ryder, this was where he had to turn off. He swung the torch round and followed the tunnel, which slanted downwards, taking him deeper and deeper into the earth. There was absolutely no sound in the mine, apart from his own rasping breath, the crunch of his footsteps, and the quickening thud of his heart. It was as if the blackness was wiping out sound as well as vision. Alex opened his mouth and called out, just to hear something, but his voice sounded small and only reminded him of the huge weight above his head. This tunnel was in bad repair. Some of the beams had snapped and fallen in, and as he passed, a trickle of gravel hit his neck and shoulders, reminding him that the Dozmary mine had been kept locked for a reason. It was a hellish place. It could collapse at any time. The path took him ever deeper. He could feel the pressure pounding in his ears, and the darkness seemed even thicker and more oppressive. He came to a tangle of iron and wire, some sort of machine long ago buried and forgotten. He climbed over it too quickly, cutting his leg on a piece of jagged metal. He stood still for a few seconds, forcing himself to slow down. He knew he couldn't panic. If you panic, you get lost. Think what you're doing. Be careful, one step at a time. Okay. He whispered the words to reassure himself, then continued forward. Now he emerged into a sort of wide circular chamber, formed by the meeting of 6 different tunnels, all coming together in a star shape. The widest of these slanted in from the left, with the remains of a railway track. He swung the torch and picked out a couple of wooden wagons, which must have been used to carry equipment down or tin back up to the surface. Checking the maps, he was tempted to follow the railway, which seemed to offer a shortcut across the route that Ian Ryder had drawn. But he decided against it. His uncle had turned the corner and gone back on himself. There had to be a reason. Alex made another 2 chalk crosses, one for the tunnel he had left, another for the one he was entering. He went on. This new tunnel quickly became lower and narrower until Alex couldn't walk unless he crouched. The floor was very wet here, with pools of water reaching his ankles. He remembered how near he was to the sea, and that brought another unpleasant thought. What time was the high tide? And when the water rose, what would happen inside the mine? Alex suddenly had a vision of himself trapped in blackness, with the water rising up his chest, his neck over his face. He stopped and forced himself to think of something else. Down here on his own, far beneath the surface of the earth, he couldn't make an enemy of his imagination. The tunnel curved, then joined a second railway line, this one bent and broken, covered here and there in rubble which must have fallen from above. But the metal tracks made it easier to move forward, picking up and reflecting the torch. Alex followed them all the way to a junction with the main railway. It had taken him 30 minutes, and he was almost back where he started, but shining a torch round him, he saw why Ian Ryder had sent him the long way round. There had been a tunnel collapse, about 30 metres up the line. The main railway was blocked. He crossed the tracks, still following the maps, and stopped. He looked at the paper, then again at the way ahead. It was impossible, and yet there was no mistake. He had come to a small round tunnel, dipping steeply down, but after 10 metres the tunnel simply stopped. But after 10, with what looked like a sheet of metal barring the way, Alex picked up a stone and threw it. There was a splash. Now he understood. The tunnel was completely submerged in water as black as ink. The water had risen up to the ceiling of the tunnel, so that even assuming he could swim in temperatures that must be close to 0, he would be unable to breathe. After all his hard work, after all the time he had spent underground, there was no way forward. Alex turned. He was about to leave, but even as he swung the torch round, the beam picked up something lying in a heap on the ground. Right, cliffhanger time. There will be a third section again today, and I cannot wait to hear what Alex does in this tunnel. Will he find that secret of Sail Enterprises? Let's find out in part 3.